Alright, so I haven't made a truly new Lost Films video in over a year, but it's not because I ran out of movies to talk about, oh no. I just got distracted with other projects and re-recording all of the older videos for the compilation. But anyway, we're starting off with a bang, another Colleen Moore movie. Coming off her huge success in Flaming Youth in 1923, Colleen Moore's next movie was Painted People. With Flaming Youth, she had finally found her perfect role as a flapper, and the advertising for Painted People really played up Flaming Youth to try to build off of the hype. But actually, Colleen Moore wasn't a flapper in Painted People, but played a kind of tangentially related role, that of a tomboy. The story was based on the short story The Swamp Angel by Richard Connell, which had a fairly typical small-town girl becomes famous plot. But how did this new movie compare with Flaming Youth? Well, let's start first with a summary. Ellie Byrne and Don Lane are childhood friends who grew up in the poor section of a factory town, their fathers both being glassblowers. Ellie does laundry for a living, but enjoys tomboyish activities like playing on the local baseball team, the Swamp Angels. Both Don and Ellie aspire to be society people. After Don saves a prominent local man's daughter from harm, he and Ellie are invited to attend her birthday party. But when they show up in very outdated and unfashionable clothes, they're embarrassed and self-conscious. Don leaves the town to become a writer, while Ellie takes up acting. 3 years pass, and Don has failed as a writer, but then he rewrites a play for Ellie that becomes very successful. Ellie accepts a marriage proposal from Preston Dutton, a society man, and Don is engaged to Stephanie Parrish, a society lady. Ellie discovers that Preston only wants to marry her for her newfound wealth, and breaks off their engagement. Don and Stephanie then break off their engagement as well, and Ellie and Don realize that they love each other and get together. Okay, so what was the reaction from audiences and critics? On both counts, it seems that the general consensus was that it was pretty entertaining. Virtually everyone had high praise for Colleen Moore, whose vivacious screen personality was new and fresh, and her natural skill as a comedienne had only recently been made clear to audiences. One satisfied theater owner in Illinois reported, "Pleased better than any picture we've had in the past 6 months. Colleen knows how to do her stuff." Moving Picture World heaped further praise on the star of the movie. Not only does she screw her face into a variety of comical expressions, but each change of her countenance shows the thoughts that are going on in her mind. In other words, Miss Moore is advancing the plot while being funny, not merely making faces. Certainly, she gives every indication of being one of the exhibitor's best box office bets if she is given good stories. The New York Morning Telegraph gushed, "Colleen Moore simply steals the whole picture, story and all. You don't seem to mind what happens as long as Colleen is on the scene." The Indianapolis News also had positive things to say about her acting. The Spectator will doubtless shout with glee at her antics, at her droll facial expressions, at her quick changes of emotion, which are as humorous as anything seen on the screen this year, and at her general air of recklessness. There were mainly 2 criticisms, one of them small and the other a bit bigger. Quite a few critics had a problem with the title. To us now, Painted People probably doesn't seem like a very controversial title, but this was 1924. Flappers had only recently made their way into the zeitgeist of the times, and the movie industry was eager to take advantage of such a hot topic. A lot of movies at this time had cheeky titles that hinted at flappers and the younger set, to entice the curious to see what those crazy young people were up to. This is exactly what Flaming Youth had successfully capitalized on. Painted referred to makeup, which could be seen as a connection with actresses, but was also a well-known characteristic of flappers. So if someone saw this movie title, it might have conjured up images and expectations of petting parties and heavy drinking. But whereas Flaming Youth had at least some risque scenes, from what I've found, Painted People had none of that. With Moore's previous role still fresh in people's minds, there probably would have been an assumption that Painted People was another flapper movie. Instead of flappers, there were laboring factory workers, high society people, and actresses, which were more traditional movie subjects. I didn't find anything indicating that audiences were disappointed at the lack of sexy stuff. Maybe Colleen Moore's performance made them forget about that. Quite a few critics, however, brought up the title issue negatively, usually saying that it was an unnecessarily provocative title for a movie that had enough redeeming features to not need it. This wasn't really a big problem or anything, it just slightly annoyed some people. The bigger criticism was that the story was lacking. The first half of the movie was more comedy-heavy, and very enjoyable by most accounts, but the dramatic parts were apparently less interesting. Variety said that the direction as handled by Badger seems to have emphasized the comedy values to the detriment of the theme, and to the extent that the film's main bid for approval will rest with the spirit in which the two leading characters are accepted, and the laughs the situations are able to secure. But since Variety has almost always given negative reviews of the movies I've covered so far in this series, we'll have to get some more opinions. Moving Picture World commented that the lack of a believable, coherent, gripping story is the unfortunate fault of this picture. Seemingly, there have been variations from the magazine story by someone who simply crammed the picture with all the so-called surefire situations he could remember. This, he seems to have argued, went over big in such and such a film, so we'll use it here. The Film Daily also spoke to this. Up to the point where hero and heroine reach their respective goals, the picture is wholly amusing. Thereafter, it takes a dramatic turn, and is inclined to slow up to the inevitable happy ending. The San Francisco Bulletin agreed. Painted People has some really enjoyable comedy situations in the early part of the picture, but is weak in the latter part of the play. The San Francisco Daily Herald also added that the latter part of the picture is rather too romantic for plausibility. But the reviewers who mentioned this kind of criticism didn't think it was a fatal flaw necessarily. It just noticeably slowed the momentum set by the first half of the movie. Painted People proved to be a good test for Colleen Moore. Flaming Youth arguably had a more interesting, or at least more provocative story. But given a movie with a weak plot, Colleen Moore held it up and made it more watchable, which was a testament to her actual comedic ability, rather than just being given good roles. The Los Angeles Express anticipated a bright future for her in the movies because of this. The brilliant little comedienne, Colleen Moore, so thoroughly captivates that there is little thought of anything but her vivid characterization of the pert little tomboy whose aim in life is to be a lady. Following so closely upon her triumph in Flaming Youth, it will place her well to the fore of screen comediennes of the day. Overall, I think one quote from Moving Picture World summarizes the general feeling toward Painted People. With a less capable cast, Painted People would have fallen flat. As it now stands, it sparkles all the way through, with real, mirth-provoking comedy, and many audiences will forgive its failure to be either realistic or straight farce. I also lean toward what the reviewer for the New York Evening World said when they called it A picture you will probably enjoy if you're not one of those unfortunates who expect the movies to do better and finer things. So basically, if you weren't a prude and were just looking for a few laughs, Colleen Moore did not disappoint. Based on reports from exhibitors about whether it was worth showing, Painted People got an average of 75 out of 100, which was pretty good, but not amazing. It was practically guaranteed to not make as big of an impression as Flaming Youth, which is exactly why it is much more forgotten. It's a shame that both of these movies are lost, because it would be so nice to be able to see Colleen Moore in her early years as a big star. But here's to hoping against hope that we'll get more footage someday. In 1926, Lois Wilson created a minor stir by getting her hair bobbed, something which was publicized. Bobbed hair wasn't really unusual by this time, but it was still newsworthy when someone famous did it for the first time. Wilson did this in preparation for her next movie role as Daisy Buchanan. If that name sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. That's because she's one of the main characters in the most famous of all 1920s American novels, The Great Gatsby. I think pretty much everyone watching this has at least heard of the book, and if you've seen my first Myths and Misconceptions video, you'll know that, perhaps surprisingly, it was not a massive success when it was first published. And its lackluster sales reflected the decline of F. Scott Fitzgerald's presence in mainstream culture. His first two novels, This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and Damned, were huge successes at the time, and Fitzgerald became regarded as an expert on flappers and the younger generation. This is in contrast to his more recent reputation as an author of deep social commentary. But The Great Gatsby had been successful enough to get a movie adaptation in 1926. It's been a while since I've read the novel, so I didn't cross-reference it with the details in the movie. Although I couldn't find a summary of the movie that was super detailed, there was a pretty good one in Picture Play magazine, so I'll just quote from that. J. Gatsby, a fellow of doubtful antecedents, is in love with Daisy, a girl far above him, and leaves for the war feeling they are married, although no ceremony has been performed. Daisy marries another in his absence. Gatsby returns to become one of Long Island's spectacular entertainers. No one knows where his money comes from, but he doesn't lack for guests on that account. Daisy's cousin brings them together again, and their blighted romance gets a fresh start, while the private life of Daisy's husband is shown to be awfully seamy. Gatsby comes to a tragic end, and Daisy somehow sees happiness ahead with her profligate husband. And I just want to add that I found a description of the last scene of the movie as a fade-out on Gatsby's grave as it's filled with mud. Alright, so before I talk about how the movie fared with the public, just so you know, a 1-minute trailer for the movie has survived, so the footage in this section is actually from the movie. But that's all we have. One thing that seemed to be a point of contention is how closely the movie followed the book. Motion Picture News thought that the story follows the novel most religiously. The Film Daily agreed, but said that this was a bad thing, that the movie adheres too closely to the book. But there's more evidence that the movie was less faithful to the book than those reviews said, and others said that the spirit of the book was not captured at all. Variety thought that the picture is not a reflection on the original novel, an excellent volume, which, because of its literary form, permits a more faithful adherence to reality than the movies. It's just a hunch, but without any more information about the movie, I'm more inclined to agree with Motion Picture Magazine's overall appraisal. If you didn't read Mr. Fitzgerald's book and have no interest in the preservation of its finer points, this is probably a very good picture, with a fair share of excitement and sex appeal. The New York World blamed Hollywood for distorting the book, writing, "The real compelling motivation of the boy's story has been lost almost completely in the cinema shuffle." There was also a little detail that I only want to talk about because it came up not once, not twice, but 3 times in reviews. One movie theater owner went on a little tangent about it, so I'll just quote him directly. "I do think I will have to take one crack at the director in regard to Warner Baxter's shirt. In spite of the fact that he displays some 5 or 6 dozen, 300 a dozen fancy shirts, he wears the same one all through the major portion of the picture, even after it has supposedly been soaked in a heavy rain, and the collar is so noticeably dirty you can almost smell it." It sounds like he would like to have a word with the continuity editor. It seems like there was at least some concern among the public about having a heavily implied bootlegger as the sympathetic main character, which is something that the reviewer for Variety brought up. As I think we all know, by 1926, many people were flouting the Prohibition law, but there were certainly quite a few other people who wouldn't have liked a movie with a criminal character that the viewer was supposed to sympathize with. And because of things like this, The Great Gatsby didn't seem to go over well in the smaller, conservative towns in the US. While researching for this segment, I found a lot of short reports from movie theater exhibitors that give an interesting look into audiences' reactions. For example, one theater owner in Rainier, Oregon complained, "My patrons told me as they came out that they come to the shows to be entertained and not to attend a bootlegger's funeral." Another in Watoma, Wisconsin said, "You fellows that feature family nights, look out for this one. Has wild petting parties, half-nakedness, sloppy drunkenness, and everything that is disgusting. Maybe all right for the cities, but is the bunk for small towns." Yet another in Parker, South Dakota piled on. "Second time recently that I have been thoroughly ashamed of a picture. Full of things that provoke censorship and bring down adverse movements in small towns." But these weren't the only reviews from exhibitors around the country. Others had more positive things to say. An exhibitor in Carmel, California reported that there was not a dissatisfied patron. Some of them are talking about the picture yet, saying that it was such an unusual picture. Another in Ashland, Alabama was shocked at how it went over at his theater. "To my surprise, this was a very good picture indeed, and after telling a number of regular patrons before playing it that I didn't think it was so good, was gratified when they informed me it was one of the best we had given them." And what's this? Variety actually called it serviceable film material and a good, interesting, gripping cinema exposition of the type certain to be readily acclaimed by the average fan? Wow, they didn't seem to say that too often back then from what I've seen. But the positive reviews are far fewer than the negative and lukewarm ones. Moving Picture World also criticized that the movie showed too many legs, baths, too much underwear. One theater owner also took offense to one vulgar and disgusting love nest scene of the sort to give the censors some reason to holler. But with all of these split opinions, one thing is pretty clear. It didn't perform very well at the box office. One theater owner in Saranac Lake, New York, warned other exhibitors about renting The Great Gatsby, regardless of its actual quality. "It is well produced, and it has a good cast, but if you buy picture-to-picture, I wouldn't go too high on this, for from my experience, if duplicated, if you do, you'd go into the red proper." Another in Graham, Texas, reported that, "It broke a record here, grossed the smallest of any picture in the 6 years this house has been running." In Arvada, Colorado, one theater owner also lamented the bad return on investment. "Showed this to a very small crowd. Would have shelved it had not rental been so high. But I took a bigger loss by running it." Another in Placerville, California, also expressed his financial woes. "One day enough for this. Business awful. First night here fair, second night terrible. Rental too high for here. Spent extra on publicity and then lost money. Many complaints, too much tragedy, and bad finish." This poor commercial performance is backed up by critics' opinions. Variety, for example, thought that, "From the artistic reviewer's viewpoint, The Great Gatsby would fetch something akin to a rave. For a commercial commentator, the conflicting emotions from the audience reaction are something to be regarded." The big question is, why did The Great Gatsby movie fail so badly? Well, of course, the book not selling well definitely robbed the movie of easy publicity. Many critics also wondered whether The Great Gatsby just wasn't good to translate into a movie. Motion Picture Magazine opined that, "There is, it seems, a stratum of life that the movies cannot approach with any real understanding, and this must be it. All the characters have been remolded into their movie counterparts, and the thing has become a conventional and not too deftly presented tale of a man who has the misfortune to love a woman outside his sphere, and of his futile attempts to raise himself to a level from which she would at least be accessible." Variety had a similar opinion, theorizing that, "The vacillating shades and touches make one wonder whether Brennan, or his scenarist, had not started out to alter the original Scott Fitzgerald story for screen purposes, and was confronted with contractual obligations to the author or other circumstances that prohibited such liberties. This is but a theory, since Fitzgerald is sufficiently established to command such special terms if so elected." Another thing to consider is the movie's overall tone. Even though the Great Gatsby movie had the sort of eccentric parties you would expect from it, the story was also pretty gloomy, especially the ending. Variety implied that it strayed too far from movie audiences' expectations. The audience finds itself somewhat befuddled. Along toward the last 20 minutes, the wife calmly states she does not love her husband, and that her affections are with Gatsby, from whom she was parted by the Great War. With that established, the audience's collective viewpoints are directed anew to the ultimate reunion of the wife of Buchanan and Gatsby, her first lover. But as we know from the plot summary, this is not what happens. Gatsby is killed, and Daisy continues on with her life with her husband. But more commentators blamed what they saw as a lack of story. The Film Daily thought that, "The story doesn't seem weighty enough for the footage it consumes." The reviewer for the Exhibitor's Herald blamed the director, Herbert Brennan, and explained, "The picture's about things that should be interesting. It has a lot of folks in it who know how to act. The yarn it is made from was said to be pretty good. Incidents involved are interesting during their individual exhibitions, but that's the trouble. They are exhibited individually. They don't jibe." Motion Picture Magazine was even harsher when it said, "Herbert Brennan has gone about misinterpreting F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel to the best of his ability." Although I should also mention that a similar number of reviews complimented Brennan's direction. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Well, I don't know. I've provided probably too many quotes about the movie that often completely contradict each other, and there wasn't really a consensus on its quality or what its flaws were or weren't, so I can only give educated guesses. I'd wager that the movie wasn't completely faithful to the book, because that almost never happens in Hollywood, then or now. Though the fact that it kept the gloomy ending makes me think that maybe it didn't stray as much as other adaptations of books did. But the fact that both F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald apparently hated the movie makes me feel like at least significant changes were made. And I'd take a guess that the deeper commentary is what didn't really make it into the movie as much. This might have made for the awkward combination of a gloomy ending without the final impactful punch. But like I said, I don't really know. So what are your theories? Share them in the comments. The last movie I'm gonna talk about is Clothes Make the Pirate from 1925. It was directed by Maurice Tourneur, who you might remember from an earlier video in this series also directed Treasure Island in 1920. So I guess he liked pirates? But Clothes Make the Pirate was not so much a swashbuckling action film, but a parody of that type of movie. The lead role was played by Australian actor Leon Errol, who wasn't a very well-known actor at the time. He had only very recently gotten into the movies, and had done vaudeville and stage shows previously. His supporting role in the Colleen Moore movie Sally gave him some praise, but that was pretty much it for his movie career so far, other than some comedy shorts and a bit part. Just like a couple of other Lost films I've covered, Clothes Make the Pirate does have a surviving trailer, so I'll use the limited footage from that in this section. Alright, moving on to the story. Errol plays the main character Tid, a bearded, cowardly tailor in colonial Boston, with a nagging wife, Betsy, played by Dorothy Gish. For escapism, he reads pirate stories, and dreams of the free and open life of a pirate. One night, he puts on some pirate clothes he made for himself. His wife walks in, and, not knowing that it's her husband, is scared of the buccaneer in her house. So she runs out to warn the town. Tid has to run away to avoid trouble, and goes into a small boat. There, he's mistaken by actual pirates for a pirate chief named Dixie Bull. Suddenly, he's a pirate captain, with a crew and a ship. Shortly afterward, Betsy is escorting her niece, Nancy, to another town on a ship, the Frolic. Tid's ship encounters the Frolic, and they engage in a battle. Tid is still his cowardly self, and immediately hides when the fighting breaks out, but his crew seems to be too preoccupied to notice. Tid's crew wins and takes the Frolic passengers prisoner. And when Tid sees Betsy among them, he gains some courage. Because Tid shaved off his beard at some point, Betsy doesn't recognize him, so he has some fun picking on her while she's at his mercy, and flirting with a vamp character, played by Nita Naldi, in front of her. Later, Tid encounters the real Dixie Bull, who challenges him to a duel. Somehow, during the duel, Dixie Bull stumbles and falls, and Tid then jumps on him for a successful capture. This makes him the hero of Boston. Tid then returns home to his wife, a changed man, a more assertive man, and she likes him much better. Oh, and there was also a side story about Nancy falling in love with a naval lieutenant, but that aspect didn't get a lot of attention in reviews. What was commented on most about this movie was probably Leon Errol's unique collapsible legs, as one reviewer put it. This was kind of his little comedic quirk. The magazine Moving Picture World described it like this: "His familiar wobbly legs again serve him in good stead. Blaming it on an old wound, he is continually falling or staggering, and each time it is good for a laugh, for Errol does these falls in his own inimitable way, a way apparently impossible for anyone else to duplicate." It's clear that this was kind of his thing, because his legs were specifically mentioned in the trailer, as you can see here. I'm not exactly sure how his leg comedy was so different, but you can judge for yourself. This was part of Errol's most used routine in the movie, and a description of it was documented by the exhibitor's trade review. It isn't with the quantity of tricks so much as with the individuality of a single good trick, that of swaying around drunkenly, and then finally sinking to the floor like a melted tallow candle, that gets the comedian across. He pulls this one continually, but the expected laugh invariably follows. Moving Picture World also mentioned that He has other amusing mannerisms, such as a ludicrous way of rolling his tongue around in his cheeks. Another little detail in the movie that I found interesting was that the intertitles mixed Old English with more modern references. It's been pretty cliché to do that for quite a while now, like saying ye old Walmart or something like that, but I guess it hadn't gotten to that point yet in the mid-1920s. Reviews for Clothes Make the Pirate seem to be pretty mixed. New York City newspaper reviews were generally positive. For example, the Daily Mirror reported, probably with some exaggeration, "We sat and shrieked with a packed Strand house, whose merriment shook the very rafters of the theater." The New York Times said that, "Mr. Errol as a swashbuckling buccaneer is enough to awaken laughter in the most morose bosom. The scenic effects are cleverly portrayed. It is an affable picture in which the absurdity of the theme is cleverly maintained." But reports from theater owners in less urban areas show that they often had a different experience. One said, "This picture holds the record for downright poor entertainment. Cost a lot of money to make, but is an absolute dud as far as entertainment is concerned." Another said it was the perfect flop, walkouts galore. Some thought the movie was good, but had poor audience reception. One said, "Hard picture to report on. I liked it, but never had so many walkouts on a picture." Others mentioned that it would likely perform better at bigger theaters, and didn't recommend it for small towns. It's a bit hard to understand exactly why that is, but I guess you can draw your own conclusions. I mean, obviously media tastes in small towns and cities can be quite different, but I would have thought that the very slapstick kind of comedy in this movie would have performed better in small towns and less so in cities, not the other way around. Poor attendance could be explained by Errol's lack of name recognition, but walkouts were definitely a sign that people just didn't like the movie. From everything I've read and the little clips I've seen in the trailer, it seems that Clothes Make the Pirate was alright if you liked pure slapstick comedy, although it may have been too drawn out. I saw multiple mentions that the length of the movie should be cut down, because people started to walk out when it slowed down in the middle. And I wonder if that may have been due to the throwaway romance subplot. But anyway, that's pretty much it for Clothes Make the Pirate. So, which of these 3 lost films would you like to see the most? Let me know in the comments. And I hope the long wait for a new installment in this series was worth it. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.